Welcome to the deep dive. We take the material you bring us, dive deep, and pull out the most important stuff.
Yeah.
Today, we are looking at a truly fascinating idea in criminology, one that completely flips the script, really, on how we usually think about crime.
That's right. Instead of always asking, why do people commit crime?
Hmm.
The question this theory poses, why don't they?
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental shift.
Definitely a shift. And the lens we're using for this deep dive is social control theory. We've got a whole stack of sources here, articles, research summaries, notes,
Hmm.
laying out its core ideas, how it developed, and, how it's been applied. So our mission today is to unpack all this with you, find the crucial points, and see what maybe surprising takeaways it holds.
Sounds good. Let's maybe start by setting the stage, looking at the theory's view of human nature, because that's where it really sets itself apart from other theories we've discussed.
Right, we've talked about things like strain theory or subcultural theories before. And they often frame crime as something people are pushed towards, right? By external forces, poverty, lack of opportunity, maybe negative peers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Social control theory, though, takes a very different starting point.
Hmm.
Its foundational premise, and the sources note it's, well, pretty provocative,
Okay.
is that humans are, by nature, actually inclined towards deviance.
Inclined towards it,
Yeah.
naturally.
Yeah. Crime isn't something you're pushed into. It's more like the default state if nothing's holding you back.
Yeah.
So what really needs explaining, according to the theory, is why most people don't commit crime most of the time.
Wow. So without something actively restraining us, the theory says we'd all just drift towards breaking rules. Maybe worse. That's quite a statement about us.
It is. It's a bold claim. And that's precisely where the idea of controls becomes absolutely central. The whole theory focuses on these internal and external factors that stop that natural inclination. These are the forces keeping us conforming. Things like, our bonds with the community, oversight from people who care about us, the rules, the authorities we deal with every day.
I see the example here in the notes about Joe. The theory suggests Joe is, well, naturally capable of doing something wrong,
Hmm.
but what stops him are the controls around him. His education, maybe his neighbors keeping an eye out. If those controls weaken, the theory says, that's when Joe might act on those tendencies.
Precisely. The controls are like a kind of social brake system, and an internal one, too.
Okay, got it. So let's trace this back. How did these ideas start to take shape? The sources mention things really kicking off in the 1950s.
Yeah, figures like Albert J. Rice were important early on. He studied probationers, and he noticed a lack of what he called personal and social controls. Things like maybe not getting needed psychiatric help, or lacking supportive families.
And he actually categorized these controls, which seems helpful. What were those categories?
Reese broke it down into three main types. First, you've got direct controls. These are the most obvious ones: punishment and rewards.
Like a speeding ticket.
Exactly like a speeding ticket. That's a formal consequence. Direct control.
Okay, that's straightforward. What's the second type?
Indirect controls. This is more about the influence of what other people think. Social pressure, basically.
Yeah.
The disapproval or maybe approval you expect from people who matter to you. The source uses the example of, like, Joe's wife not liking his aggressive driving. He might slow down not because he fears a ticket, but because he doesn't want her disapproval.
Makes sense. The informal pressure. Okay, and the third?
Internal controls. This is the stuff inside the individual. Your own conscience, feelings of guilt or shame. It's tied strongly to whether you've actually internalized the norms and values of your community. Learned behavior, often from early life.
Right, right. Building on this, the sources bring up Jackson Tobey in 57 and his idea of stakes of conformity. This feels pretty intuitive.
It really does. Toby argued that, look, young people might all face temptations, right? But those who've invested more in conventional society, who have these stakes in conforming, they're less likely to risk losing all that.
So if you're doing well in school, you've got a good reputation, your parents approve, you have more to lose.
Exactly. A lot more to lose by messing up. That investment itself acts as a powerful deterrent. It holds you back.
Okay.
The sources also connect this back to the Chicago School and Walter Reckless's containment theory. Reckless talked about internal containments, things like being able to tolerate frustration, having a strong self-image, really believing in the rules, and external containments like good parental guidance, school rules, supportive friends.
And his point was that crime usually happens only when both layers are breached. Like the Joe example, getting into a fistfight at work. He'd have to ignore the workplace rules that's external and lose his internal control over anger.
Precisely. Both the external rules and the internal self-restraint need to fail, essentially.
Okay, this leads us nicely into Sykes and Matza, also in 57. They introduced this really interesting idea that, well, maybe anyone could commit crime if controls fail, using something called neutralization.
Yeah, neutralization theory really challenges that idea of a distinct criminal type. It suggests that when controls weaken, anyone might find themselves capable of doing something deviant.
How?
Well, Sykes and Matza argued they do it by using these techniques of neutralization. These are basically temporary justifications, excuses, really. They let people temporarily set aside their usual values and rationalize the deviant act just long enough to go through with it.
Ah, so like mental loopholes. What are some of the main techniques they talked about?
Exactly. Mental loopholes. They function as sort of temporary moral holidays. The sources list 5 key ones. There's denial of responsibility.
It wasn't my fault.
Right, I was drunk. I was forced into it. Then denial of injury. Nobody really got hurt. They can afford it.
Okay.
Denial of the victim. They had it coming. They deserved it. Condemnation of the condemners.
Pointing the finger back.
Yeah. Who are you to judge me? You're just as bad. Or the system's corrupt anyway. And finally, appeal to higher loyalties. I did it for my friends. I had to protect my family.
You hear versions of these all the time, even for minor things. Like the examples in the sources, someone cheating says I was drunk, or justifying a fight because the other guy deserved it. It's not just for serious criminals.
Absolutely not. They're everywhere in human behavior, explaining away little things and big things. And building on this, Matza later came up with drift theory.
Drift theory.
Yeah, the idea that people aren't necessarily committed criminals or committed conformists. They sort of drift back and forth between conventional and deviant behavior, often using these neutralization techniques when controls are temporarily weak.
So it's not a permanent state, just a temporary slide, maybe made possible by these justifications.
Okay, so we've got early ideas, containment, neutralization, drift. But the sources really emphasize that social control theory became a major force in the 60s, largely thanks to Travis Hershey. Absolutely. Hershey's social bond theory is probably the most famous version. He really hammered home the idea that it's the strength of an individual's bonds to conventional society, its institutions, its people that prevents crime.
So stronger bonds mean more to lose, higher stakes.
Exactly. Stronger bonds mean higher stakes of conformity, more effective containments keeping you in line, and just less likelihood of drifting into deviance.
And he broke down this idea of bonds into 4 specific types, right? What were they?
Yes, 4 key types of social bonds. First, attachment. This is your emotional connection to other people, family, friends, teachers. If you care about them and what they think, you don't want to disappoint them. That holds you back.
The emotional ties. Okay, second.
Commitment. This is more about your rational investment in conventional life. Your education, your job prospects, your reputation. You've built something up, and you don't want to risk it by breaking the rules. You have a stake in the system.
Your investment. Got it. Third.
Involvement. This one's pretty simple. It's just being busy with conventional activities. School clubs, sports, hobbies, a part-time job. If you're heavily involved in positive things, you literally have less time and opportunity for trouble.
Just being occupied. Makes sense. And the fourth bond.
Belief. This is about whether you actually buy into the shared values and norms of society. If you genuinely believe the rules are right and important, then breaking them goes against your own principles, not just some external law.
And Hershey actually tested these ideas, didn't he? With that big survey of high school students in San Francisco.
He did, and his findings were really significant. They strongly supported the theory. He found that kids with stronger social bonds, especially attachment to parents, consistently reported less delinquency.
Regardless of background.
Yeah, more so than factors like social class, which really challenged some existing theories that focus on disadvantage. He also found delinquents were more likely to say they disliked school and felt less attached to their conventional friends.
So it wasn't just who they were or where they lived, but the strength of those connections pulling them towards conformity. Or, I guess, the weakness of those connections letting them drift. Okay, now, this is where the sources say things took another turn. Hershey later worked with Michael Gottfredson, and they shifted the focus even more inward.
Right. They got really interested in explaining that consistent pattern you see with age and crime, the age-crime curve, how crime tends to peak in the late teens, early 20s, and then drops off.
Okay.
And their big contribution, their highly influential theory, zeroed in on internal control, specifically the concept of self-control.
And the basic idea is people with high self-control are just less likely to commit crime.
Essentially, yes, throughout their lives. They argued that low self-control is the key predictor of criminal behavior. And crucially, they put a huge emphasis on parenting in developing that self-control.
How so?
They link things like poor monitoring of kids, inconsistent discipline, harsh or neglectful parenting.
Yeah.
They linked all that strongly to children developing low self-control.
And the really striking point from the sources is their argument that this level of self-control gets set really early, right? And stays pretty stable.
Yes, that was a core and maybe controversial part of their theory.
Mm.
They argue that your fundamental level of self-control is largely established by about age 8.
Wow, that early.
Yeah, formed through that early socialization, mainly in the family. This makes those early childhood years absolutely critical, and studies do tend to back this up, showing that low self-control in childhood is a pretty strong predictor of later offending.
Okay, so we've traced the evolution, external controls, containment, social bonds, and finally this focus on internalized self-control. Let's step back and evaluate the theory based on the sources. It starts with that provocative assumption about human nature we mentioned.
Yeah, that premise that we're naturally deviant and only controls stop us is definitely point of debate. It can seem quite pessimistic about human nature, suggesting crime is almost inevitable if controls fail.
But the sources also highlight its strengths. It's been hugely influential, no doubt. And it seems to have clear practical value, especially focusing on those informal controls, family, school, community, not just the police and courts.
Absolutely. That broader view of control makes it very useful for thinking about prevention. But the sources are also clear about some significant criticisms.
The one that really jumps out is the problem with assuming all bonds are, good or crime preventing.
Yes, this is a major logical hurdle highlighted in the critiques. Social control theory, especially Hershey's version, doesn't deal well with situations where people have really strong bonds, but to deviant groups.
Like gangs.
Exactly. Gangs, criminal families, delinquent peer groups. In those cases, strong attachment and commitment to the group can actually encourage crime, not prevent it. The theory struggles to differentiate between conventional bonds and deviant ones.
Right. Being super loyal to your gang buddies isn't going to stop you from committing crimes with them. It probably makes it more likely.
Precisely. And then there's the issue of exceptions. The theory doesn't perfectly explain everyone. You find people with apparently strong conventional bonds who still commit serious crimes.
And the opposite, too.
And the opposite people with seemingly weak ties to conventional society who are perfectly law-abiding. It suggests the link between bonds and behavior isn't always simple cause and effect.
So it gives us powerful insights, but maybe oversimplifies things a bit, doesn't capture all the complexity.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
The sources note the research support is generally seen as moderate to strong Hershey's own work. Studies like Ivan Nye's on family controls, lots of research linking low self-control to crime.
Mm-hmm.
But they also stress that most researchers today see control as just one important piece of a much bigger puzzle. Theoretical pluralism, they call it. No single theory explains everything.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift then to the practical side. How has social control theory actually been used on the ground for crime prevention? This is the utility part.
And this is arguably one of its biggest strengths. It offers really clear pathways for prevention. The focus shifts to strengthening those bonds and building self-control before crime happens, rather than just reacting with punishment afterwards.
So the idea is to create programs that boost those four bonds.
Hershey talked about attachment, commitment, involvement, belief.
Exactly. Interventions designed to, say, improve family relationships, get kids more engaged in school, encourage positive activities, foster a belief in the rules. It also means training people like parents and teachers.
Training them how?
Training them in how to create supportive, structured environments and how to help kids develop self-regulation skills, managing emotions, controlling impulses, that sort of thing.
And the Seattle Social Development Project, the SSDP, is presented here as a really key example of this in action. What was that about?
The SSDP was this major long-term study. It started intervening with kids way back in first grade and followed them for years. And it was comprehensive. It targeted the students, their teachers, and their parents.
What's a multi-pronged approach? What
Yeah.
did they do specifically? Well, students got training in social-emotional skills, managing impulses, choosing pro-social friends. Teachers learned about effective classroom management and providing support. Parents got training on things like consistent discipline, showing support, and helping their kids build self-control.
So really trying to strengthen those bonds and build skills across the board, a core idea was spotting risk factors like low self-control early on and proactively fostering connections to family, school, positive peers.
Exactly that, proactive and broad-based.
And the results. The sources suggest they were pretty impressive when they looked at these kids later, right? Like at age 18.
Very impressive. Compared to a control group that didn't get the intervention, the kids who went through the SSDP program showed significantly lower rates of delinquency, substance abuse, and violent behavior by age 18.
Wow. So that study really seems to show that this approach, early comprehensive prevention focused on bonds and self-regulation, can actually work. It can make a real difference long term.
It strongly suggests it can. It reinforces the idea that effective crime prevention isn't just about police and prisons. It requires this collective effort, families, schools, communities working together to address those root causes, like weak bonds and low self-control. It's preventive, developmental, community-focused.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, then, social control theory gives us this powerful alternative way to think, especially about that initial question. Why are most people, most of the time, actually law-abiding?
It really does. It provides a compelling answer by focusing on the constant push and pull of internal and external controls. It suggests it's when those controls break down for whatever reason that the potential for crime emerges. And importantly, this can happen in various environments, which helps it complement other theories like strain or social disorganization.
It's clearly popular, has a lot of research behind it, but we do need to keep in mind that starting assumption about, natural deviance and that tricky issue with explaining bonds to deviant groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a vital piece of the puzzle for understanding both conformity and deviance, but like the sources suggest, it's probably best viewed as one significant factor within a much larger, more complex picture.
Exploring social control theory really makes you think about the kind of invisible scaffolding that holds society together, doesn't it? The unseen forces guiding us every day. If our bonds and our self-control are the main things keeping deviance in check, well, what does that say about the state of community ties or maybe individual resilience today? And thinking about that critique, the problem with deviant bonds, how do we even begin to sort out which connections protect us and which might actually pull us towards harm? Definitely leaves you with some things to chew on.